Thank you, everybody. Thank you. Good morning and welcome. I'm Margaret Bashir. I am the UN correspondent for the Voice of America, and I am delighted to be here in my personal capacity this morning as your Master of Ceremony for the morning session. Today we commemorate the 15-year anniversary of the unanimous adoption of UN Security Council Resolution 1888, which, among other important steps, established the mandate of the Secretary General's Special Representative on Sexual Violence and Conflict. The mandate tasked the SRSG with leading efforts to address sexual violence and conflict while engaging in advocacy efforts with governments, civil society, and parties to conflicts. We welcome our co-sponsors for today's event, the Special Representative of the Secretary General on Sexual Violence and Conflict, Pramila Patten, the Ambassador of Switzerland as the current President of the Security Council, the United States, Norway, the UK, the DRC, and Sierra Leone. Now I have the pleasure to give the floor to the Special Representative of the Secretary General on Sexual Violence and Conflict, Under Secretary General Pramila Patten.
Thank you, Margaret, for your introduction and for moderating today's event. Excellencies, Secretary Clinton, distinguished participants, ladies and gentlemen. 15 years ago, the world's paramount peace and security body unanimously created a mandate to combat the scourge of wartime sexual violence. That founding Security Council Resolution 1888 responded to the brutal reality of modern war, in which sexual violence is often a deliberate tactic rather than a byproduct, and in which women and girls are often intentionally targeted, not merely incidental victims or so-called collateral damage. It recognized that, like bullets, bombs, and blades, the widespread systematic use of sexual violence decimates communities, drives displacement, and inflicts trauma that echoes across generations. The reason for that historic Security Council decision is represented here today. It was a mandate created for the sake of survivors and those working to support them on the front lines, often underfunded, under-equipped, and under fire. I therefore wish to begin by paying tribute to the courageous survivors and advocates who have joined us today. Thank you for lending your voice to the global search for solutions. When we listen to their testimonies, I urge all of you to consider the countless victims across time and space whose words will never be heard or heeded by those in positions of power. For every story we hear, let us remember thousands upon thousands are lost to history, shrouded in the fog of war or suppressed by a conspiracy of silence that serves to shield the perpetrators. Since taking up this mandate in 2017, I have met with survivors in many war-torn corners of the world and carried their ground truths to the corridors of power. I have focused on giving survivors from remote and volatile theaters of war a platform on the world stage. This is why the centerpiece of today's event is a survivors' hearing, to amplify the voices of survivors and to signal our solidarity. Yet, 15 years on, survivors need more than solidarity. They need decisive action to turn resolutions into results through enhanced service delivery, economic opportunity, and access to justice and redress. Above all, they need peace and peace of mind. No amount of protection, assistance, or accountability after the fact is a substitute for peace. The message of this mandate over many years has been clear. We must silence the guns and unmute the voices of survivors as a critical constituency for peace. Empowering survivors is key to social transformation that addresses the root causes of conflict, such as inequality and exclusion. The aspiration of this mandate is not just a war without rape, but a world without war. Not simply to apply the law, but to deliver justice that is felt in communities as well as in courtrooms. Yet, as we are all painfully aware, we live in uniquely dangerous times marked by cascading crises, record levels of displacement, and runaway military spending. Generational gains on gender equality are being thrown into reverse by rising militarism, coup, and unconstitutional seizures of power. We see warfare erasing decades of development gains virtually overnight, decimating the infrastructure and institutions vital to public health, welfare, and education. The figures speak for themselves. In 2023, over 170 conflicts were recorded. The number of people forced to flee war and persecution surpassed 117 million. Global military expenditure exceeded a record-breaking $2.2 trillion USD, and more than 612 million women and girls now live under the shadow of conflict. Since the resurgence of hostilities in the Sudan, night and day, there have been new reports of rape, gang rape, abduction at gunpoint, and sexual slavery. Millions have been driven from their homes in search of safety and sustenance as man-made famine looms. When I visited the refugee settlement along the border and the spontaneous campsites in eastern Chad, the sense of helplessness and hopelessness was palpable. Several women were told by their attackers, "We will make you give birth to Arab children." I was told of a woman who lost her life in an attempt to terminate a pregnancy by recourse to dangerous medication. And I met a grandmother who told me that after fleeing the fighting in Khartoum, she had been unable to protect her 6-year-old granddaughter from being raped in the camps where they sought refuge. There has been a staggering 288% increase in the number of survivors seeking services for gender-based violence in 2024, though the humanitarian country team stresses that those who come forward represent just a fraction of actual cases. In Myanmar, sexual violence is wielded as a tool of terror and political repression, including in detention settings, to silence opposition. My mandate continues to report patterns of sexual violence during village raids and ground operations by the Myanmar Armed Forces and affiliated militia. I have visited Rohingya refugee survivors in the mega camps in Cox's Bazar, Bangladesh, who face elevated risk of exploitation and trafficking, compounded by diminishing humanitarian aid and global attention. Those survivors have been repeatedly interviewed, the prospects for justice, redress, and safe return remains elusive. In Ukraine, the full-scale military invasion by the Russian Federation has caused a devastating loss of life and critical infrastructure. Cases of conflict-related sexual violence have been documented against civilians, including in temporarily occupied territories and during house raids, as well as against detainees and prisoners of war as a method of torture. I visited Ukraine in 2022 as soon as the first reports of sexual violence surfaced and signed a framework of cooperation with the government. The widening war in the Middle East has devastated and displaced countless civilians. The report of my mission to the region earlier this year found that there are reasonable grounds to believe that sexual violence occurred in at least 3 locations in southern Israel during the 7th October attacks by Hamas. We also found clear and convincing information that sexual violence, including rape, had been committed against some of the hostages held in captivity and may be ongoing. Deeply disturbing reports have also surfaced of sexual violence being perpetrated against Palestinian men and women held in Israeli detention, including rape and forced nudity. I have consistently called for the unconditional release of all hostages, an immediate ceasefire to end the appalling bloodshed, and for independent investigations into all alleged violations in order to hold the perpetrators accountable and deter further abuse. In the Democratic Republic of the Congo, while important progress has been made in the fight against impunity, the renewed hostilities with the M23 have led to a resurgence of horrifying patterns of sexual violence, driving thousands of civilians into displacement camps. When I visited those camps, I heard how women and girls have resorted to prostitution out of sheer economic desperation. Today, in relation to each of these conflicts, we will hear some of the human stories behind the headlines and statistics. The stories of survivors who could be your mother, your brother, your daughter, or friend. Ladies and gentlemen, even as entrenched wars march on, new threats and threat multipliers continue to emerge. For instance, nowhere is a gender-based digital divide more acute than in conflict settings, hampering women's access to essential information. At the same time, technology has enabled the spread of misogynistic hate speech and incitement to violence. In Haiti, acts of sexual violence have been filmed by armed gangs in order to extort higher ransom from the relatives of kidnapped victims. Climate shocks have increased the risk of intercommunal violence, including sexual violence in Somalia, South Sudan, and elsewhere. I believe we have reached an inflection point in this agenda. We must either scale up our collective response to protracted and emerging threats, or we risk the rollback of gains made over the past 15 years. Indeed, there are ever-increasing demands on this mandate. The number of country situations within my remit continues to grow. The operating space for civil society partners continues to shrink. Attacks on frontline humanitarians and human rights monitors, including arbitrary arrest, have spiked. And our latest report finds that UN-verified cases of conflict-related sexual violence rose by an alarming 50% last year. The robust prevention and response infrastructure, which the Security Council established in 2009, requires sustained political backing and financial support. This includes my mandate to provide coherent and strategic leadership to global efforts, working primarily through the Interagency Initiative UN Action Against Sexual Violence in Conflict. The UN Action Coordination Network, which I chair, has grown from 12 members in 2017 to 26 members to date, and serves as an incubator and delivery system for knowledge products, guidance, and tools, including our prevention framework to improve practice in the field. UN Action has implemented joint catalytic projects in settings such as the DRC to support survivors in the artisanal mining sector to access medical, psychosocial, and reintegration assistance. In Ukraine, to equip survivor relief centers. In Mali, to assist survivors and children born of rape. In Sudan, to provide safe shelters and emergency relief to survivors in Darfur. In South Sudan, to empower survivors and bolster their resilience through livelihood opportunities. And in Somalia, to support the reintegration of women and children abducted by Al-Shabaab to mitigate stigma and ostracism. The resolution also established a team of experts on the rule of law and sexual violence in conflict to strengthen institutional safeguards against impunity. Justice can have a cascading effect, whereby each verdict inspires another survivor to come forward, and each sentence deters another would-be perpetrator and puts commanders on notice. Over time, this can convert cultures of impunity into cultures of deterrence. In recent years, we have seen that where there is political will, matched with capacity and resources, accountability is possible. For instance, in Guinea, where a former head of state has been convicted for a massacre and mass rape of peaceful protesters. In the DRC, where there have been multiple sexual violence convictions of both notorious warlords and members of the national armed and security forces. In Nigeria, where members of Boko Haram have been convicted of sexual violence as a tactic of terrorism. In Iraq, where pursuant to the Yazidi Survivors Law, over 1,600 victims of sexual violence and other atrocities committed by Daesh have received benefits and reparations. In Ukraine, where the Office of the Prosecutor General has established a specialized unit to investigate conflict-related sexual violence. And in Colombia, where the Special Jurisdiction for Peace has opened a dedicated macro case on these crimes. The Security Council further called for women protection advisors to be deployed to the field, to enhance our monitoring, reporting, and response, and to deepen the evidence base for action. This critical capacity must be maintained during and after the drawdown and transition of UN mission. In addition, to address the cross-border dimension of this crime, a regional specialist has been deployed to the UN office, to the African Union, to monitor patterns and trends, which is a precedent that should be expanded to other regions of concern. As part of our operational methodology, which anchors commitments at the national level, my office has signed over a dozen joint communiques and frameworks of cooperation with almost all of the countries we cover. At the same time, we have engaged with non-state actors implicated in patterns of sexual violence to foster compliance and behavioral change. This morning, we will screen a new documentary that highlights a sample of impactful interventions by the mandate to combat impunity, foster political will, deliver multi-sectoral assistance to survivors, and mitigate stigma. This provides a snapshot of what works and could be replicated and taken to scale as we move from impunity to unity of action. Ladies and gentlemen, our efforts over the past 15 years have brought this crime out of the shadows and into the center of peace and security policy. Today, we have the tools, we have the resolutions, we have the red lines. We now need sustained political resolve and resources equal to the scale of the challenge. Survivors and frontline service providers are fighting this scourge, and we must give them a fighting chance. Every measure, every step taken by my mandate is guided by the rights, needs, and perspectives of the survivors as my moral compass. The dawn of a new chapter in the history of this mandate is a chance to put survivors first and deliver on their demands. We know that the arc of history is long, but it bends towards justice. Collectively, we must continue to bend it further and faster in the name of every victim, every survivor, and every generation yet to come. Thank you for your attention and continued commitment to this cause.
Thank you, SRSG Patton. UN Deputy Secretary General Amina Mohammed was planning to be with us today, but she is on travel, unfortunately. But she has sent us a video message to voice her support for the mandate. So I draw your attention to the screen.
Excellency Ms. Denise Nyakio Tshisekedi, the First Lady of the Democratic Republic of Congo, Excellencies, SRSG Patton, ladies and gentlemen, friends. I'm really pleased to join you on behalf of the Secretary General to commemorate the 15-year anniversary of the Mandate on Sexual Violence in Conflict. This occasion calls on us to reflect on the immense bravery of survivors, the unyielding determination of activists, and the essential support of service providers who help heal wounded communities. Despite the culture of silence and shadow of stigma that shrouds these abuses, The voices of those who have endured sexual violence in conflict illuminate our path with their resilience and demand our steadfast commitment to justice. Special Representative Patton, I commend your leadership in amplifying these voices, ensuring that they're not only heard, but also heeded in the halls where policies are shaped and mandates are fulfilled. We convene today against a backdrop of growing global unrest, with conflicts at their highest since World War II and a record 120 million individuals displaced by conflict. In this climate of escalating militarization and diminished freedoms, sexual violence continues to be weaponized to terrorize and destabilize communities, especially women. Alarmingly, perpetrators often evade accountability, and frontline service providers who offer refuge and restoration are increasingly under attack. Sexual violence in conflict continues to shatter lives and hinder societal progression. This heinous crime is not only a gross violation of human rights, but also a formidable obstacle to peace, security, and development. In 2015, with the adoption of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, the world pledged to leave no one behind. Yet the scourge of sexual violence continues to hinder progress. From Gaza to Ukraine, from Sudan to Myanmar, from Colombia to the Democratic Republic of Congo, survivors face not just isolation, but often complete social and economic destitution. Achieving the SDGs is intrinsically linked to ending gender-based violence, including violence inflicted in wars and conflicts. At the recently concluded Summit of the Future, global leaders have adopted a pact for the future and reaffirmed their commitment to the Women and Peace and Security agenda and to advancing gender equality and the empowerment of all women and girls. This recommitment is part of a broader effort by the United Nations to combat conflict-related sexual violence. Friends, as the Secretary General's new agenda for peace underscores, dismantling patriarchal and oppressive structures is crucial. Protecting women and girls is paramount for their active and equal participation in peace processes, recovery, and development, and in shaping the future of their communities and nations. The urgency to combat sexual violence in conflict has never been greater. We must hold perpetrators accountable, but equally, we must innovate to prevent these atrocities in the first place. We must identify innovative and creative strategies, not only to respond to conflict-related sexual violence, but to prevent it, and finally consign such violations to the annals of history once and for all. A multidimensional problem requires all hands on deck for a solution. We need to engage not only with the UN member states, but with private sector partners, civil society, academia, the media. Together, we can achieve this. Let us commit to a future where sexual violence in conflict is eradicated. Let us build a world where every individual lives in peace, free from fear, violence, injustice, and inequality. Thank you.
It's now my honor to welcome Her Excellency Hillary Rodham Clinton, 67th Secretary of State of the United States and former First Lady. In September 2009, Secretary Clinton presided over the UN Security Council's unanimous adoption of Resolution 1888 during the U.S. presidency of the Council. She has also spent much of her career fighting for the rights of women and children. Madam Secretary, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Margaret. I am deeply honored to be here today to commemorate the adoption of this extremely important Security Council resolution. I want to thank Special Representative Patton for her tireless commitment to the mandate that she carries here at the United Nations, and to your team that supports you as you fulfill the work that is necessary to deal with conflict-related sexual violence. I also want to acknowledge and thank the governments of Norway, Sierra Leone, Switzerland, and the United States. As has been said, 15 years ago, I was honored to introduce this landmark resolution. and preside over a unanimous vote to adopt it. On that day, the global community came together to recognize finally the importance of protecting women and children from targeted sexual violence in conflict zones. Now, we knew this mandate would be just one step on a long journey. And in the years since, there has been progress, but not enough. Rape and other forms of sexual violence are still too often viewed as collateral damage of war and internal conflict. In too many countries and in too many cases, the perpetrators of this violence still go unpunished, and their impunity encourages further attacks. Whether it is government military and police forces, insurgencies, militias, terrorists, all of this must be condemned in the strongest possible terms, and we must continue to work to prevent it. We have seen it across the globe. You know the countries that have already been mentioned, from Colombia and Haiti to Israel, Iraq, others in the Middle East, from Kosovo to Myanmar to the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Sudan, so many countries. And so we gather here today to do what we can once again to raise awareness and to speak out against the brutal sexual violence against women and girls, men and boys, young and old. You know, the dehumanizing nature of sexual violence doesn't just harm a single victim, not even that victim's family, nor her village and community. It harms all of us. It sends a message that we are never safe, that we are always in danger. It erodes political and economic stability. It undermines development. And we need to understand that it holds all of us back, and our continuing failure to address it effectively erodes our collective will, our shared humanity. It cuts to the core of the UN's mission. So now we once again must recommit ourselves, not only to protect vulnerable people and promote human security, but to uphold the legitimacy of this body. Now, ending conflicts is, of course, the most certain path to ending sexual violence in conflict, so pursuing peace must be our highest priority. And as we do so, there are also steps we must take to support survivors. That starts, as it does here today, with listening to survivors who know best what they need to recover with justice and dignity. They are asking for resources like training for law enforcement, prosecutors, judges, service providers, psychologists, and other stakeholders in trauma-informed approaches to dealing with conflict-related sexual violence. For example, the CIMA network in Ukraine, an organization dedicated to serving survivors of wartime sexual violence, is doing vital work to raise awareness across villages, to reach out to survivors, to create safe spaces for them to share their stories. The international community should learn from this work, support it, and scale it so it reaches more people. Second, it's time to support reparations for survivors. In Kosovo, survivors of wartime sexual violence are receiving monthly compensation and even in some cases, pensions. But sustained funding is needed to meet survivors' needs. Third, legal recognition of survivors as civilian victims of war is essential, including for children born of wartime rape. As we learned from the wars in the Balkans, granting legal status to survivors so they can claim financial, health, and psychological support without deadlines is critical to their recovery, and it has a generational impact. Fourth, and perhaps most importantly of all, accountability is crucial, and it begins with those at the top. Those who order attacks on civilian populations and those who carry out the attacks using systematic rape. They are guilty of crimes against humanity and must face consequences. That's why today I am calling for Russia to be added to the UN Secretary General's list of shame. I am under no illusion that shame alone will stop the Kremlin's bloody war. A war that it has not only carried out by emptying its prisons, dragooning its own civilians off of streets to be pressed into war, but is now about to use soldiers from North Korea to continue this bloody, unjustified, unprecedented invasion. No country is safe from this kind of war-mongering leadership, and it is time that the United States recognizes the harm that Russia is causing not only to the people of Ukraine, but to world peace and stability. Now, I know Putin has no shame, but we owe it to the people of Ukraine and to survivors of sexual violence everywhere to call out these terrible crimes. Russia should also be included in the annual report by the UN Special Representative on Sexual Violence in Conflict, which details patterns of wartime violence and identifies perpetrator countries. And international organizations should support Ukraine in preparing its own report that will provide critical evidence to reinforce the need for accountability and justice for victims in Ukraine. Now, 15 years ago, on the day we adopted this resolution, I told the story of women survivors whom I had met in eastern Congo, who, after recovering from their horrific injuries, went back into the forests to rescue other women who had been attacked and left to die. They shared a saying that I still think of often. No matter how long the night, the day is sure to come. Well, the day is now, the day for a very bright light on what is happening to women and children around our world. We cannot drag our feet or look the other way when there is suffering at this scale. It is my hope that we leave here today reinvigorated and committed to prioritizing safety and accountability no matter who the perpetrator is. And that after this long night of darkness and violence, we will all be moving one step closer to daylight. Thank you.
Thank you, Secretary Clinton. Thank you so much for your powerful words and your long commitment to this mandate. Now I am pleased to give the floor to our co-sponsors. I am delighted to invite Her Excellency Denise Inyakiru Tshisekedi, First Lady of the Democratic Republic of Congo and a global champion in the fight against conflict-related sexual violence, to take the floor.
Mesdames et Messieurs,
Ladies and gentlemen, all protocol observed, I am greatly honored to be here before you to commemorate the 15th anniversary. I'm deeply honored to be here before you to commemorate the 15th anniversary of the mandate of the Special Representative of the Secretary General responsible for the issue of conflict-related sexual violence. Today, we are looking both at progress accomplished and issuing a reminder of the challenges which remain to be faced to eradicate sexual violence as a weapon of war. I should like to express my deep gratitude to my sister Pramila Patten, as well as to member states and all stakeholders for their dedication and unwavering support in driving forward this vital agenda. The adoption of Resolution 1888 in 2009 was a decisive starting point. It placed this issue at the very heart of international priorities. Ladies and gentlemen, every conflict, wherever it may be, leaves in its wake women, men, and children seared by deliberate acts of sexual violence. These victims all deserve the same attention and the same justice wherever they may be. I wish to remind you that conflict-related sexual violence does not have a single face. It's not restricted to a single region. Indifference dehumanizes victims and those who avert their gaze. Those who look away from the suffering of others are guilty of a crime. My country, the Democratic Republic of Congo, for 30 years has been the theater of conflict where sexual violence has been used as a weapon of war. Thousands of lives have been shattered, but we have taken strong measures. In 2019, through my initiative, Plus Forte, the Stronger, I placed combating violence as a national priority. I lent my voice to the survivors and worked to restore their dignity. Thanks to our commitment, we adopted Law 22/065 of the 26th of December 2022, laying down the fundamental principles of protection and reparation for victims. This law enshrines not just free legal aid for victims and the creation of the National Fund of Reparation, FONAREV, which is already operational. This fund, one of the first in Africa, thanks to the support of the Technical Office of Madame Pramila Patten, offers to survivors an opportunity for socioeconomic reinsertion and makes the DRC a model of leadership in our combat here. Ladies and gentlemen, we have to remember that the suffering of the victims of sexual violence knows no borders, no race, no nationality. The suffering of a human being should never be put in a hierarchy according to geography. If we shut our eyes to the suffering of survivors in regions which are less publicized, we run the risk of seeing the cycles of violence and impunity being perpetuated. It's not just a question of what is right, but it's also a matter of our collective security, our safety. I therefore call for a mobilization of more equitable and more just resources so that all victims, regardless of their place of birth or the context or where they've suffered, have access to justice, reparation, and an opportunity to rebuild their lives. Ladies and gentlemen, as we today mark the 15 years of the Special Representative's mandate, we have to look to the future. This mandate has given a voice to survivors and made it possible to mobilize a consistent international response to these atrocious crimes. Actions such as the establishment of FONAREV provide evidence of this. We have to continue to support this mandate with the same energy, and we have to define an ambitious roadmap for the next decade. it is imperative that no survivor be forgotten anymore and that no crime remain unpunished. I conclude by turning directly to you, dear survivors, men and women amongst you. For 15 years, you have not been alone any longer, and you will never be alone in the future. We shall continue to allow you to be heard and to work so that sexual violence becomes a far-off memory. Peace is not defined by the absence of war, but by the presence of justice. It is this justice that we have to seek to ensure for all survivors, regardless of any place or any time. Dear Pramila, my sincere congratulations to you for your dedication to this cause. May God reward you. Thank you.
Thank you, Madame Tshisekedi. Now I will turn to Dame Barbara Woodward, Permanent Representative of the United Kingdom to the United Nations, to say a few words.
Thank you, Margaret. And let me start by thanking SRSG Pattern and Excellencies, and also to extend a very warm welcome and our deep appreciation to the survivors who have joined us today. The UK has been a proud supporter of the SRSG's mandate since its inception 15 years ago, and we remain a donor. And I pay tribute to SRSG Pattern and her predecessors and their teams for their dedicated work over the last 15 years. The UK remains committed to this agenda, and what we mean by this agenda is the women and the girls and the survivors behind it, and to our Preventing Sexual Violence in Conflict initiative, which has supported thousands of survivors since 2012. Despite these efforts, however, we have not collectively made enough progress. The prevalence of conflict-related sexual violence is increasing. Conflict is at an all-time high, and impunity remains the norm. In DRC, as we've heard, CRSV continues to surge as communities are displaced. In Sudan, there is horrifying evidence of widespread sexual and gender-based violence, with millions still at risk. And in Israel and the occupied Palestinian territories, there have been appalling reports of sexual violence. And SRSG Pattern told us in her briefing what that really means, whether you are a 6-year-old girl or whether you are a grandmother. Yet CRSV is not and does not have to be an inevitable consequence of war. So let's work together to redouble our efforts. First, we must prevent CRSV before it occurs. This is the best way to prevent devastating impacts on survivors and communities. The UK is proudly supporting the SRSG's prevention framework and generating rigorous evidence for what works to prevent violence in communities. Second, as my Prime Minister said at the UN last month, we must end impunity. Too few victims and survivors receive the justice they deserve. That is why the UK is supporting the progress of a Crimes Against Humanity Convention to strengthen the legal architecture and secure accountability for survivors. And we look forward to seeing the film a little later. Finally, we must keep survivors at the centre of everything we do, ensuring participation is meaningful, respectful, and safe. And again, I thank those who have joined us today. The UK has also established a survivor advisory group to inform our approach. So today, we celebrate 15 years of dedicated effort, and we resolve and recommit to do more together to consign these atrocities to the history books. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. I now invite Ambassador Pascal Beresville, Permanent Representative of Switzerland and the UN Security Council President for October, to say a few words.
Merci. Thank you very much. Excellencies, dear colleagues, allow me at the outset to express my sincere gratitude and to present my respects to the survivors who have come from all over the world to share their testimony with us today. Your voices are powerful, and your courage, strength, and determination inspire me deeply. It is an honor today to speak before you all, and I thank the SRSG and her team and all our colleagues with which we have worked to prepare this meeting. Allow me also that I am speaking here in my national capacity, but also as I am the president of the Security Council. It is with pride to note that my president is in a plane as we speak to land in a few minutes here in New York, because she will preside over the annual debate tomorrow. She is a president who was born in a country where at a time where she had no political rights. Now, I apologize to my staff because I'm going a bit off script, but I want to share a few personal items. I began my career combating sexual violence against women, first as an activist, then a researcher, and then a judge in my own country, Switzerland. From this work, I drew two conclusions. First, that violence against women is probably the most frequent crime in my country in the context of domestic violence, and one that is very rarely punished. So there is a major degree of impunity there. Secondly, in working with survivors, I got to see that the victims were not merely victims, but also powerful women ready to make change. When I moved to Vietnam, we continued our work there as Vietnam was working to eliminate domestic violence, which is extremely frequent against women in Vietnam, more frequent in conflict situations or in countries immediately after conflicts. And once again, we can hear the voices of the survivors as actors of change. But I also think that each country and each situation needs its own strategy that involves the women concerned, the survivors, to develop these strategies. I came to New York in 2008 when the Security Council adopted a first resolution responding to sexual violence. And at that time, between the community, female activists, the question was, should we focus on women victims under 1325, which does include protection as one of its pillars. But a year later, when Hillary Clinton presided over this debate, we understood that we needed a strong voice for the women who are victims so that they could be actors for change. And since that time, we have had 3 SRSGs who have truly made a difference. Allow me to stress the 2 essential points that we believe are crucial in this debate. Firstly, sexual and gender-based violence continues to hamper the participation of women in peace efforts and security efforts. In many regions, these are used to target women in the front lines, particularly those who provide essential services, document human rights violations, and advocate for peace. Situation in Myanmar is a stark example where sexual violence is systematically used to punish female human rights defenders, either for opposing the political situation or for having defied the entrenched patriarchal norms. Noh Ser Ser, the advocate for peace, reminded us of this clearly during the open debate last year. As a co-chair of the group of experts of the Security Council on WPS with Sierra Leone, Switzerland remains determined to ensure that these situations, including in Myanmar, become the target of sustained attention and so that they guide the Security Council in its actions. Secondly, we must redouble our efforts so that the perpetrators are held responsible for their actions. Impunity for sexual violence remains omnipresent and is completely unacceptable. Without accountability, lasting peace will remain unattainable and these crimes will continue. Accountability is one of the most important prevention tools, and it requires strong financing and political support. Switzerland has contributed to these efforts by supporting a study from the CTED on strengthening accountability for sexual and gender-based violence linked to terrorism, which is an area that still doesn't receive the recognition it deserves. Here I wish to congratulate the SRSG, Ms. Patton, and her team of experts, whose devoted work over the last decade has led to significant verdicts against perpetrators. Switzerland is proud to support her office and UN action in accomplishing their mandate. Ending impunity does not only bring justice to survivors, but also ensures that women can fully participate in complete security in peace processes, including in conflict resolution and prevention. Tomorrow, as I said, the president of our Swiss Confederation will have the honor of presiding over the annual open debate. This important debate will be an opportunity to stress and recognize the varied and crucial roles of women in peacebuilding. It is also the time to commit to act to ramp up women's inclusion. I am convinced that the testimonies that we will hear will remind us that awareness raising is not enough. We must bring them justice. It is time to take decisive and immediate measures. I thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Beresville. We will all be looking forward to that debate tomorrow. And for those of you who are watching online and would like to watch it, you can see it on the UN webcast. It starts at 10 a.m. New York time. Now I welcome Ms. Rachel Vogelstein, the Deputy Director and Special Assistant to the President on the White House Gender Policy Council. Ms. Vogelstein, the floor is yours.
Thank you to Special Representative Patton and her team of experts for gathering us here today and for your leadership on this important agenda. The United States is pleased to co-sponsor today's event, and we congratulate the United Nations on 15 years of impactful contributions to our collective efforts to prevent, address, and promote accountability for conflict-related sexual violence. I also want to recognize and thank the survivors and advocates who are with us today. Your presence brings to light both the atrocity of conflict-related sexual violence and also the enduring resilience of survivors. The mandate that we recognize today is rooted in UN Security Council Resolution 1820, which first recognized that conflict-related sexual violence is a security issue and an attack on peace, stability, and human rights. And 15 years ago, as we heard from Secretary Clinton, under her leadership, the United States was proud to preside over the Security Council's adoption of US-sponsored UN Security Council Resolution 1888, which first established a special representative of the Secretary General on sexual violence and conflict to lead, coordinate, and advocate for efforts to end this scourge. President Biden and Vice President Harris have continued and expanded U.S. commitment to addressing this human rights abuse. 2 years ago, President Biden issued an historic presidential memorandum on promoting accountability for conflict-related sexual violence, which strengthened our government's exercise of financial, diplomatic, and legal tools to hold perpetrators of conflict-related sexual violence to account, including by imposing the first ever set of U.S. sanctions solely focused on this issue. and we have been proud to lead efforts to address conflict-related sexual violence through our foreign assistance and humanitarian aid programs, including by providing rape kits and health care for survivors, by training militaries and peacekeepers, prioritizing gender-based violence prevention and response in emergencies through our Safe from the Start initiative, and advancing justice and accountability efforts. But as the Special Representative's annual report issued earlier this year reminds us, sexual violence remains pervasive in conflicts around the world, from Ukraine to Sudan, and from Haiti to Hamas's terrorist attacks against Israel on October 7th, with cases of sexual violence increasing by over 50% last year alone. It is clear that we must do more to prevent conflict-related sexual violence in the first instance, to support survivors and communities, and to hold perpetrators accountable. That is why Vice President Kamala Harris launched the Dignity and Documentation Initiative earlier this year to improve documentation of crimes of sexual violence and conflict. Specifically, the initiative will provide justice for survivors, help hold perpetrators to account, and increase resources available to survivors of sexual violence. And after 15 years of working together under the mandate of Resolution 1888, we know that no one government or organization can address this issue alone. That's why today the United States is proud to invite governments, multilateral institutions, foundations, and civil society organizations to join us in supporting the Dignity and Documentation Initiative to promote justice and accountability for this aberrant human rights abuse. Today, let us rededicate ourselves to building a future where women and girls and all people can live free from violence, abuse, and fear. We stand ready to work together with other member states committed to addressing sexual violence wherever and whenever it occurs, and to continue supporting the efforts of the Special Representative of the Secretary General on Sexual Violence in Conflict. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. Vogelstein. And now I welcome Signe Gillen, Norway's Special Envoy for Women, Peace, and Security.
Dear colleagues, I'm pleased to be speaking before you today on the 15 years commemorate of the UN Security Council Resolution 1888 and the CRSV mandate. Women, peace and security is a key element of Norway's efforts to promote peace and security and the heart of our own security policy. Resolution 1888 was a milestone resolution recognizing the use of sexual violence by parties to conflict as a threat to international peace and security. Since the beginning, Norway has been a strong supporter of the CRSV mandate, both politically and financially. Your direct work with armed forces to end the use of CRSV, the important work by your team of experts to ensure effective legislation and strengthen prosecution processes globally, the cooperation with UN missions to ensure they have the right expertise, and the holistic assistance to survivors by and through UN action are all very important. We are considerable contributors to the UN action, including in countries such as Ukraine, and we have enjoyed a very fruitful partnership with you, SRG Patton, and your team. Your tireless efforts are invaluable. I also want to thank you for coming to this CAC conference in Oslo 2 years ago and put a special emphasis on children's need. Unfortunately, I must say, the CRSV mandate is currently more relevant than ever. Presently, there are more than 110 ongoing armed conflicts globally, and the number of armed groups has sharply increased. The number of reported cases of CRSV has doubled. Women and girls are disproportionately affected, but we know that men and boys are also at risk, especially at detention centers. It harms individuals, and it is used to destabilize entire communities. The effects are felt for generations and may be a basis for renewed conflicts. Sudan represents a gruesome example of this. Widespread use of sexual violence has been documented against women, children, and men, mainly by the Rapid Support Forces and affiliated groups, but violations by the Sudanese armed forces are also documented. It is not the first time CRSV has been used in warfare in Sudan. It is totally unacceptable and must be stopped. Allow me to highlight 3 points from the Norwegian perspective. As we mark the 15-year anniversary of the CRSV mandate, we see a need to scale up the efforts to prevent sexual violence from happening in the first place. Parties to conflict must comply with the obligations under international humanitarian law. Stop the use of sexual violence. Civilians must be protected. Perpetrators must be held accountable. Second, women and women-led organizations must be included in all stages of peace efforts and in humanitarian response. The leadership is important. I remind you all of the 1% to local organizations. Lastly, the right and need of survivors in all their diversity must remain at the forefront. Accountability measures must respect the priorities, safety, security, and well-being of the survivors. Services must be age and gender sensitive, survivor-centered, and trauma-informed. We must stand united in ensuring prevention, accountability, and justice, and protection for survivors. We must protect international law. We encourage renewed support for the mandate of the SRG. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And now, finally, I welcome His Excellency, Ambassador Amara Sawa, Chargé d'Affaires of Sierra Leone to the United Nations.
Thank you, Margaret. As the first and maybe the only male speaker this morning, I hope my statement resonates with the thoughts, hopes, and unspoken voices of all of the men in this hall here this morning. Your Excellencies, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, I thank the organizers of this important event and welcome all the team of experts. 15 years ago, Sierra Leone was on the agenda of the Security Council, still recovering from a brutal civil war. Today, we are members of the Security Council, advocating for women's empowerment and gender equality as part of our priorities. 15 years ago, the Special Court for Sierra Leone had concluded the trials of most of its defendants, while President Charles Taylor sat in The Hague. Those trials laid bare our wounds and our traumas from the 11-year civil war. Horror stories made up of child soldiers and bushwives, and estimates of 250,000 women and girls raped or sexually abused during the war. But they also helped us heal and move on. Those trials do not just represent the first instance since Nuremberg that a head of state has been successfully brought to justice, but also sets important international jurisprudence on sexual violence and forced marriage. The prosecution of perpetrators in this instance would not have happened without the bravery of many women from Sierra Leone who came forward to bear testimony, like the many survivors from across the world that have done so today and on many other occasions in this chamber. The recognition of conflict-related sexual violence as a threat to international peace and security in 2008 by the Security Council, and the successful prosecution of perpetrators of this most heinous of violations in the Special Court for Sierra Leone served as an impetus for subsequent governments to strengthen the legal and regulatory framework for women's socio-economic empowerment in the country. In 2008, Sierra Leone began operationalization of 3 groundbreaking gender laws on divorce, traditional marriage, and property rights for women, commenced reparations for a fraction of the survivors of CRSV, and became the fourth country in Africa and seventh globally to adopt a national action plan on women, peace, and security. We have since launched our third national action plan on the 3rd of October, 2024. Today, millions of girls and women across the continent of Africa are at risk of gender-based violence, which is often used by conflict parties as a tactic of war. In the Sahel, entire swaths of territory are controlled by terrorist groups that subjugate women and girls and strip them of their fundamental rights. In the Lake Chad Basin, schoolgirls are still abducted as part of the perverse economy of armed groups. In the Democratic Republic of Congo, there has been a 300% increase in reported cases of gender-based violence in the last 3 years, and displaced women and girls around Goma are forced to engage in survival sex or are attacked as they leave camps in search of food and firewood. In Libya, the situation for women's rights organizations is getting worse, and there is pushback against the mere use of the word gender, making it much harder for the UN or civil society organizations to serve women and girls in Libya. The prevalence of CRSV and SGBV across the African continent and many other areas across the globe point to the need for an integrated regional and global response to institutionalize the wider WPS agenda beyond the strides we are making at national levels. In Sierra Leone, even as we strengthen our respective legislative and policy frameworks to protect girls and women from sexual violence, discrimination, and child marriage, mainstream gender into our national development plans, and improve on consultations for our national action plans, we still need these efforts amplified and supported in practical ways with human and financial resources and political will at the regional and global levels. In closing, I want to reiterate Sierra Leone's commitment to prioritizing and supporting strategies that engender formal and informal peace building and human security processes for peacekeeping, peace prevention, and peace negotiations. We particularly call for support for rigorous accountability mechanisms in response to the crimes of CRSV, for a more comprehensive and inclusive approach that goes beyond silencing the guns in these countries. I thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. It's encouraging to hear about the progress Sierra Leone is making. Thank you to all of our co-sponsors for your steadfast support. And now I'm going to ask everyone to look for the translation piece at your seat. You're going to use it now to listen to a short documentary featuring some of the important moments and milestones of the last 15 years. But you need the earpiece for the audio, so please pick it up.
In every war, sexual violence has been used as a tactic to instill fear, to dominate, to displace population.
The earliest documents of conflict all record sexual violence, sexual slavery, rape.
Wars have been fought on the bodies of women. Impunity was the norm, and justice the rare exception.
Their suffering was not taken seriously.
Was completely trivialized.
But why wasn't it treated with equivalent gravity by the international community? So many people would say, you will never get a Security Council resolution on rape. There was this sense that it's somehow an unseemly matter for a serious security body.
In spite of all the calls of the Security Council, that there was not much progress, that in fact it was getting worse.
Ladies and gentlemen, despite some progress in responding to sexual violence in armed conflicts, the deliberate targeting of civilians continues unabated.
What prompted its adoption was a serious concern about the systematic use of sexual violence as a tactic of war.
The role and rights of women in today's world is a critical core concern of foreign policy. It is national security.
Security Council Resolution 1888 contains very strong language on the need to end impunity. It contains very strong normative provisions. It gives the mechanism, the team of experts, and what the team of experts has to do. My role is to provide coherent and strategic leadership. My strategic priorities are implemented by the UN Action Network.
All of these tools could be brought to bear on what had been called history's greatest silence and the world's least condemned crime of war.
So we will do more to prevent violence against women and girls, but we will also do more to end the conflicts that have made women and children their primary victims.
For the first time, the Security Council saw wars through the eyes of women and girls. It brought hope for women all over the world.
So Resolution 1888 was adopted. So we're celebrating, and we walked out of the UN complex. And I remember we walked straight into a cluster of protesters holding up placards of women, pictures taken on cell phone cameras of women being raped in broad daylight for daring to peacefully protest for democracy. And I remember thinking, this chasm between the realm of high politics and the reality on the ground, that is the disconnect that this new mandate has to bridge.
Le 28 septembre 2009, c'était un lundi. Mon fils aîné était au stade. C'était juste un meeting qui devait se dérouler au stade. Et malheureusement, c'est son corps qu'on a retrouvé le 2 octobre 2009.
During a peaceful political rally, no less than 115 people were killed, and at least 109 women were brutally raped.
Alors, c'est depuis lors que je me suis engagée de recherche de vérité et surtout de pouvoir éradiquer l'impunité dans le pays. Nous sommes allés dans les familles et pour voir exactement ce qui s'est passé parce que, vous savez, question de viol, c'est tellement tabou en Guinée. Dans le quartier, tu es abandonné. Dans ta famille, il y a la stigmatisation qui est là. Parce que ces femmes, elles n'ont plus de mari. Et elles se demandent comment vivre pour ne pas être stigmatisées dans la ville. Malheureusement, il n'y a pas eu de dépôt judiciaire. Cela, les avocats ont tout fait, mais ça n'a pas marché. La junte au pouvoir, ils avaient le pouvoir encore.
Security Council Resolution 1888 establishes the team of experts mandated to support national governments to strengthen rule of law, to work with national justice system, both civilian and military, and to take a very holistic approach supporting justice and accountability. It is today supporting no less than 12 countries.
Estamos en el año 2016, acabamos de llegar de La Habana. En pocos días tendré el encargo de viceministra de llegar a un acuerdo final para la terminación del conflicto con las FARC y la construcción de una paz estable y duradera.
After more than 5 decades of bloodshed,
más de 28,000 violaciones.
To put an end to 52 years of a bloody war that has left more than 220,000 people dead and millions displaced. Juan Manuel Santos and the leader of the FARC, Rodrigo Londoño.
50 changes. El tema de la violencia sexual durante el conflicto tuvo un papel central en la mesa de negociaciones. Siguiendo la tendencia internacional, la violencia sexual como crimen de violación a los derechos humanos no es amnistiable. Sus responsables no pueden recibir beneficios que los exoneren de su responsabilidad. Tienen que acudir a la justicia especial que fue creada y es primero reconocer por primera vez en el país la violencia sexual como un crimen de guerra y como una grave violación a los derechos humanos. Fue absolutamente significativo.
What this mandate represents is that international law is not an empty promise, that international law is not an empty threat.
Dans la ville de Kavumu, il y avait les viols d'enfants qui est commis par une milice qui était dirigée par un député provincial. On ne pouvait pas intenter une action en justice contre cette personne-là sans qu'on soit rassuré que ses immunités lui soient enlevées, lui soient retirées.
The TOE has been very, very instrumental in securing the investigation, prosecution, and conviction of a range of emblematic cases of warlords who thought that impunity was the rule of the game.
L'heure de l'impunité a sonné et que les auteurs peuvent être recherchés et peuvent être arrêtés.
The work in the DRC started in 2012, and the TOE is still supporting the government of Democratic Republic of Congo. And what we have seen over the past 15 years is weak legal institutions, gaps in substantive laws, but also procedure. And this is what prompted me to work on model legislative provision and guidance on investigation and prosecution, which contains state-of-the-art provisions that would allow any prosecutor to prosecute any form of sexual violence.
Hundreds of people have died in the violence, and scores more have been raped and tortured, but the perpetrators have not been brought to justice.
You cannot talk about justice and accountability in a vacuum. You really need a robust legal framework because laws influence behavior. In Central African Republic, the Office of the Prosecutor General was very prompt in establishing the Special Criminal Court, which resulted last year in a landmark judgment.
Juge de la Cour pénale spéciale déclarait les 3 accusés coupables de crimes de guerre et crimes contre l'humanité.
We have embarked on a series of partnerships. We have broadened our allies. We are today working more and more with concerned states parties and providing them support.
Thousands have been killed in Ivory Coast's 2002 civil war and the 2011 post-election violence.
Côte d'Ivoire is the only example of a national armed force that has been delisted from the annex to the annual report. They were listed initially because of patterns of sexual violence linked with the elections.
478 cas de violences sexuelles documentés.
Resolution was passed in 2015 that said if you are blacklisted for sexual violence, you can no longer contribute to UN peacekeeping. So a huge reputational risk.
Général Bakayoko, chef d'état-major, a dit que cette liste-là était une liste de la honte. C'était d'abord l'honneur de la Côte d'Ivoire. Il y a un proverbe africain qui dit que le poisson pourrit par la tête. Et donc c'est en 2013 que le ministre des Affaires étrangères a fait une déclaration d'engagement. Nous avons donc organisé des ateliers, des plaidoyers de haut niveau, comme on a dit. Mais en réalité, c'était une formation pour que les chefs comprennent ce que c'est que les violences sexuelles liées au conflit. Ensuite, les commandants d'unité, ils ont été formés de la même manière. Donc, pour la troupe, c'était plus facile. Ensuite, il y a la période d'observation. 2018 nous a permis de confirmer les 0 cas et donc on a été délisté en 2018.
Today, as a reflection of the significant progress towards restoring peace and security in Côte d'Ivoire.
It's often said that resolutions are passed in poetry, but they're implemented in prose. And I think moving forward, we're really looking at an era of enforcement and implementation.
I have signed 12 joint communique and frameworks of cooperation with government. And where there is genuine political will, with adequate resources.
The year is 2017, and the conflict in Myanmar has escalated in Rakhine State. The conflict was described as a textbook case study of genocide. Killing, maiming, rape was used as a weapon of war to destroy the dignity of the community, to also displace them, because rape pushes populations very quickly. Refugees and displaced people have started to arrive in Bangladesh. The way Rohingya women arrived generated a lot of empathy within Bangladeshi population and within the government. This is something that really upset them. I can describe the role of the SRSG as someone who opened the door. She influenced the government of Bangladesh to allow services and also to create that space, have the policy framework adjust to the service provision in a safe and dignified manner. She also played a role in bringing the resources and the political will together for those who provide services on the ground. The advocacy she has carried out has resulted in accountability mechanisms, being receptive to sexual violence in conflict, and the empowerment of the survivors in different international accountability mechanisms.
With my first field missions to Cox's Bazar, I saw traumatized women who had been through the worst types of sexual violence, and yet sharing their stories. I could see that the work that we have done around shifting the shame from the victim back to the perpetrator has yielded results. I have always privileged first-hand interaction. In July of 2017, I did 3 field missions to DRC, Maiduguri, Eastern Nigeria, and South Sudan. And I met with a range of survivors, and they helped me to frame my strategic priorities for the mandate. I have made survivors my moral compass. Everything that I do for this office, I am guided by these survivors. So UN Action is the mechanism through which my strategic priorities for the mandate are implemented. And today, the network of 26 UN entities are united in enabling that survivor-centered approach. The UN Action Network has grown exponentially from 11 entities in 2017 to 26. Now, more than ever before, the UN is working as one.
In 2022, the government of Ukraine, jointly with UNFPA, crafted this unique model of assistance. So everything is coordinated, and we also coordinate the efforts within the UN Action Project.
On the 3rd of May 2022, I signed a framework of cooperation with the government of Ukraine. Since then, my office and the UN system have been supporting the national authorities to implement a comprehensive plan of action.
The Survivor Relief Center is psychological support, social assistance, medical consultations, and legal aid. But when cases of conflict-related sexual violence are identified, they are approached by a GBV case manager who is ready to assess both psychological, social, and other conditions of the person and draft an individual plan. This approach, it prevents people from stigmatization, from discrimination, and from re-traumatization through their experiences. We hope that this will encourage other survivors to apply for services, to seek for justice, for reparations. The meaningful participation of survivors, listening to their stories, making their voices heard, validating their experiences, this is what can lead to durable working solutions.
As I reflect on my own vision for the mandate, I am very clear-eyed about the uniquely dangerous times that we are living. But at the same time, I will not allow this bleak global landscape crush my hope for this mandate. I will not allow the gains to be taken away. I owe it to the survivors.
When we mark the 15-year anniversary, it's important to recall that the measure of success is not more reports and meetings and mechanisms, but less violence, less war, less rape.
Every case of sexual violence is preventable, and it is the moral responsibility of everyone to work towards its prevention.
On est arrivé le 31 juillet 2024 pour annoncer un verdict final. On se demandait est-ce qu'on allait voir ce jour, malgré qu'on a perdu nos copains et nos copines. Mais nous, on est là.
I felt very privileged to attend the trial against former President Addis Camara and 10 co-defendants.
For the repression, the court sentences Colonel Claude Peevey to lifetime imprisonment with a security period of 25 years.
It was a conviction for crime against humanity pronounced by a domestic court.
Et lorsque la sentence est tombée, je ne sais pas comment ça s'est passé, mais les larmes ont coulé. Et tout le monde a pleuré dans la salle. Et finalement, justice nous a été rendue.
You know that there is a kind of saying that full recovery is impossible without justice.
Vous continuez encore les enquêtes, et au bout du tunnel, on voit la lumière, et cette lumière-là, au lieu d'être étouffée, elle éclaire tout le monde, et tout le monde voit. Never give up.
Over the past 15 years, we've developed a comprehensive normative framework. We've drawn a red line. We've developed the institutional architecture. We have improved our operational reach. But what we really need in terms of the next phase is an era of enforcement, compliance, consistent and timely prosecution of these crimes, which translates ultimately into deterrence.
Over the past 15 years, we have produced very, very concrete results in a very positive way. Today, the UN is reaching out to thousands of survivors who were once invisible and inaccessible. So we have moved the needle in terms of justice and accountability. It is true that sexual violence in conflict remains underreported due to shame, stigma, fear of reprisals, amongst other reasons. But I've also observed over the years that survivors, if you provide them with an enabling environment, with the holistic services that they need for their recovery, they do break the silence. There isn't a day that I wake up I look at myself in the mirror and I say to myself, Pramila, you have to do more for these survivors. They are my moral compass. They have a voice. I only amplify their voice.
It just needs resources, it needs societal shifts, it needs political will. So this will conclude the first portion of our morning segment. I want to thank all of our speakers on this panel. I ask you to join us in the audience, and we will make room for our next portion of the meeting, and that will be when we hear from several survivors of conflict-related sexual violence from different parts of the world. As SRSG Patton said in the documentary, survivors are the driving force behind this mandate. And I invite you to the podium, along with Dr. Justin Paluku-Lucy, CEO and co-founder of Heal Africa, and Ms. Nimet Ahmadi, president of the Darfur Women Action Group, to join us at the dais here. Okay, and I invite our survivors to come to the podium and take their seats, please. Okay, I think we're just about ready to start on the second part of our program. Thank you. First, we will hear a testimony from Eileen Kanega Mwamini, a survivor from the Democratic Republic of the Congo. Eileen, the floor is yours.
Madame la représentante spéciale.
Special Representative of the Secretary General on conflict-related sexual violence, ladies and gentlemen, all protocol observed. Dear survivors, good day. It is often very difficult to speak on this subject, as these images in my mind bring me back to the pain of that time. Allow me here to share my story with you. I am Madame Nigaline, one of the thousands of survivors of sexual violence in the DRC. It was one night on the 12th of November, 2001. I was 12. After a family meal, my parents, sisters, and brothers sent us to bed. But several hours later, we heard shots mingled with cries and tears. We were terribly frightened. There was FDLR armed men who were pillaging, massacring, and raping in my village in the Walungu territory in South Kivu. These people massacred my mother, my big sister, before my eyes. 2 years later, we left to enter a refugee camp. And there, my father was died after a cardiac attack. In the same day, we heard cries, "Monkie, monkie," which means "wake up, wake up." Once again, it was FDLR militants from a neighboring province that had invaded all the neighborhoods and had spread horror and desolation, killing some and cutting the throats of others like animals with machetes. There was a systematic rape of women and girls, and houses were pillaged. We were taken and brought to the national park along with others of my neighborhood. During the day, they ordered us to carry the goods that they had pillaged from my village. In the forest, I became a sexual slave for one of the chiefs, and this lasted more than 2 years. And then they let us go without killing any of us, but we were all mentally deceased. Today, I am the single mother of 8 children, including children born of rape, abandoned by their fathers. Less than 4 years ago, through the care of Dr. Nwege, the Nobel Prize winner, I was able to reach the stage that I am in today, despite the trauma that has remained within me. Since 2017, with survivors of sexual violence and conflict, we have established a network and solidarity between us. We have a national movement for children born of violence in our country, but we cannot carry out many activities because we have a lack of financial partners. I wish to take this opportunity to ask the United States to pressure the armed actors in the DRC so that rape is no longer used as a weapon of war, and to continue to support the government of the DRC in bringing to justice all those perpetrators of these odious crimes. Help the government to put into place transitional justice measures, because lasting peace must be reached in the DRC. There must be a program for the reinsertion of children born of rape, and there must be a holistic care program for them. And finally, we must ensure that the national reparation funds take into account the urgency of caring for children born of rape. Many live in the street, abandoned by their mothers and their families in general. This must be a priority amongst the reparations for sexual violence. I have told you my story, and I thank you.
Eileen, thank you, and your children are lucky to have such a brave and courageous mother. I now give the floor to Dr. Justin Paluku-Lucy, CEO and co-founder of Heal Africa, based in the Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo.
I am Justin Paluku-Lucy, an OBGYN at the Heal Africa Hospital in Goma, in the east of the Democratic Republic of Congo. Today, I bring to you the voice of Kikwembe, a 12-year-old girl who has lived in an IDP camp since she fled the war that destroyed her village in the Masisi territory. Having witnessed the brutal execution of her parents, their throats cut before her very eyes, she fled to escape this horror. On the way to Goma, she met two armed men who not only sexually violated her, but also kept her captive for a month. During this time, she was forced both to be a servant and to carry weapons. She finally was able to escape, pregnant and riddled with infections of which she knew nothing. Having arrived at the IDP camp in Bulengo, in Goma, without a place to go, she built a makeshift shelter. Unfortunately, that very night, she was attacked by unknown armed men who raped her once again and then forced a piece of wood into her vagina while threatening to kill her if she cried out. By chance, she was directed to one of our safe spaces in the camp by a member of the community. And this was so that she could enjoy holistic care that was adapted to her needs. After a clinical exam following complications, she was referred to Heal Africa for specialized care. Kikwembe's case is one of 1,203 pregnancies from rape that were documented by Heal Africa between January 2023 and June 2024. Of all these pregnancies, 870, or 72%, were documented during the first part of 2024 alone. During that same period, 5,951 rape cases were documented by Heal Africa, amongst which 185, or 3.1%, involved children under the age of 10. Of all these cases, 15% of the rapists were armed, and 11% were in police or military uniform. 57% were civilians, while 17% were intimate partners. Day after day, the institutions of care face these types of horrors. Each of these 5,951 rape cases was unique, each as shocking as the next, where each stage of their care reveals ever greater distress. In the city of Goma, the complex rape cases are referred to Heal Africa by other medical bodies. This increases the pressure on financial and human resources available. To give you an idea, the local treatment cost for a complicated rape case varies between $800 and $1,800 US. The insecurity forcing continued displacements of civilians, including survivors of sexual violence, hampers the operationalization of care institutions and complicates the continuity of care. Currently, the IDP camps, which currently contain more than 500,000 people around the city of Goma, are where sexual violence continues to be committed because of overcrowding and a lack of adequate protection for women and girls. This is compounded by logistic challenges to reach the survivors and bring them to places of care. Having ambulances for their evacuation is an urgent need. The phenomenon of survival sex, which takes root when there is a lack of a response to vital basic needs, particularly food, in IDP camps and in households, is something that must be reckoned with. Faced with extreme poverty, women and young girls begin to be sexually exploited and begin forced prostitution in the Goma region brothels. The challenges in caring for survivors of sexual violence in the east of my country are complex and multifaceted. They involve security, economic, social, and psychological challenges. The response to these challenges, therefore, requires a multidimensional approach, one that involves not only humanitarian efforts, but also actions to reestablish peace, bolster local capacity, and combat the impunity of these perpetrators. Supporting local and international initiatives while improving coordination between the various stakeholders is crucial to put an end to this violence. I thank you.
Must recognize the important work that all NGOs are doing on the ground, on the front lines, helping survivors, particularly in this case, particularly the children. I would like to welcome now Ludmila Husseinova, who is a survivor from Ukraine, and she will be assisted by an interpreter.
Дякую, вітаю.
Thank you. Hi.
Мене звуть Людмила Гусейнова, і понад 3 роки я була в російському полоні.
My name is Lyudmila Husseinova. I was held in Russian captivity for over 3 years.
Я пережила там катування і сексуальне насильство.
During which I endured torture and sexual violence.
Я була звільнена по обміну 2 роки тому, 17 жовтня 22 року.
I was released in a prisoner exchange on October 17, 2022.
І майже відразу приєдналася до спілки жінок «Сема Україна» і вже 2 роки вимагаю звільнення з російського полону цивільних жінок, громадянок України, котрі досі знаходяться там.
Since then, I have joined the SEMA Ukraine Women's Association and have been advocating for the release of Ukrainian civilian women still held in Russian captivity.
Їх тисячі. Вони переживають страшні страждання. Вони розлучені з дітьми. Вони не мають жодної медичної, юридичної допомоги.
There are thousands of them, suffering unimaginable horrors, separated from their children, without access to medical or legal aid.
Щоб ви уявили, що таке російський полон, я розповім вам, що там відбувається.
To give you an idea of what Russian captivity entails, I'm going to tell you this.
За 3 роки перебування там мене жодного разу не виводили на вулицю.
During my 3 years of imprisonment, I was never allowed outside.
На допити виводили в кайданках із мішком на голові.
I was taken to interrogations in handcuffs with a bag over my head.
За 3 роки жодного побачення з рідними.
I had no contact with my family.
Жодного листа від них.
No letters.
Це були щоденні побиття і катування.
I received daily beatings and torture.
Вони казали мені, що неважливо, скільки тобі років, ти будеш робити те, що нам потрібно.
They told me that it didn't matter how old I was. I would do whatever they wanted.
І вони це робили.
And they enforced this.
І я чула, як вони це робили з іншими дівчатами, з чоловіками.
I heard them do the same to other prisoners, both women and men.
Сема Україна започаткована в 2019 році за підтримку фонду доктора Деніса Муквеги.
SEMA Ukraine was established in 2019 with the support of Dr. Denis Mukwege Foundation.
Об'єднує жінок, котрі постраждали від сексуального насильства, пов'язаного з конфліктом.
And it unites women affected by the conflict-related sexual violence.
У 2022 році наша організація була зареєстрована офіційно і на зараз об'єднує між собою майже 60 жінок.
In 2022, our organization was officially registered and now includes around 60 women.
Це жінки, котрі постраждали від сексуального насильства, починаючи з військової агресії Росії проти України з 2014 року.
Those are women who are victims since the war beginning of the 2014.
В моїй країні продовжується жорстока війна.
In my country, the brutal war continues.
Продовжується захоплення і окупація наших міст.
Russia continues to occupy our cities.
Продовжуються воєнні злочини, зокрема незаконні затримання, тортури і сексуальне насильство проти цивільного населення України.
And war crimes persist, including illegal detentions, torture, and sexual violence against Ukrainian civilians under the occupation or forcibly taken to Russia.
Але ми в цих надзвичайно важких умовах, в умовах агресивної війни, робимо все, що від нас залежить, аби надати допомогу постраждалим від СНПК, і жінкам, і чоловікам.
Despite these extreme conditions, we are doing everything in our power to assist those affected by conflict-related sexual violence, both women and men.
Хочу підкреслити, що в Україні на системному рівні докладається багато зусиль для реагування на СНПК та подолання наслідків війни з боку Росії.
I would like to emphasize that on a systematic level, Ukraine is making significant efforts to address and mitigate the consequences of conflict-related sexual violence stemming from the war with Russia.
Хочу подякувати Офісу Праміли Патен за постійну підтримку постраждалих від СНПК, за увагу до України.
I want to express my gratitude to Pramila Paten's office for their continuous support of survivors and their attention to Ukraine.
І хочу сказати, що постраждалі, зокрема починаючи з 2022 року, активно залучаються як державою, так і міжнародними партнерами та організаціями громадського суспільства до розробки та реалізації важливих політик і програм, спрямованих на захист їх прав і надання допомоги.
I want to highlight that their active involvement of survivors starting from 2022 in developing and implementing important policies and programs both by state, international partners and civil society organizations.
Наш досвід і голоси стали невід'ємною частиною процесів прийняття рішень, що сприяє більш ефективній відповіді на наші потреби.
Their voices and experiences have become an integral part of decision-making processes, enabling more effective responses to their needs.
Це не лише підвищує якість наданих послуг, але й забезпечує справжню участь постраждалих у відновленні їхнього життя та соціальної інтеграції.
This not only improves the quality of services provided, but also ensures genuine participation of survivors in rebuilding their lives and social integration.
Ми вдячні фонду доктора Деніса Муквеги, Глобальному фонду постраждалих, а також агенціям системи ООН, зокрема ООН «Жінки» та фонду ООН в галузі народонаселення за підтримку нашої діяльності та наших ініціатив.
We are grateful to Dr. Denis Magac Foundation, the Global Survivors Fund, and UN agencies, particularly UN Women and the UN Population Fund, for supporting our initiatives.
А ще раз повторюю, що також дякуємо Офісу спецпредставниці пані Патен та мережі дії ООН проти СНПК.
We also appreciate the Special Representative Office at the UN Action Network on conflict-related sexual violence for their continued effort.
Ми вдячні урядовій уповноваженій з питань гендерної політики країни, Офісу віце-прем'єрки з питань євро та євроатлантичної інтеграції за постійне залучення постраждалих до роботи.
We also acknowledge the contribution of the Government Commissioner for Gender Policy and the Office of the Deputy Prime Minister for European and Euro-Atlantic Integration for their continuous engagement.
Щодо позитивних прикладів, то варто відмітити, ви сьогодні це бачили, відкриття за ініціативи держави та спільно з ООН центрів допомоги врятованим, де постраждалим від сексуального насильства пропонується спеціалізоване соціально-психологічне консультування, правова підтримка, а також ведення випадку кейс-менеджером для того, щоб встановити контакт між постраждалим і відповідними фахівцями для отримання різних послуг.
A notable achievement is the establishment of centers for assistance to survivors, initiated by the state and in collaboration with the UN, offering specialized socio-psychological counseling, legal support, and case management for victims of sexual violence.
І кожна людина працює з конкретним спеціалістом, який закріплюється за нею і супроводжує протягом усього процесу реабілітації, в незалежності від місця перебування, наприклад, у випадку переміщення постраждалої особи на іншу територію.
Each person is paired with a specialist who supports them throughout the rehabilitation process, regardless of their location, ensuring continuity of the care even if the person is relocated.
Жінки СЕМА Україна стали надихаючим прикладом для чоловіків, постраждалих від СНПК, і котрі зараз об'єдналися в чоловічу організацію «Алумні».
The women of SEMA Ukraine have become an inspiring example for men who have also been victims of conflict-related sexual violence, including those in the men's organization Alumni.
Протягом майже року відбувалася пілотна програма відновлення та реабілітації жінок, які постраждали від насильства під час війни.
Over the past year, a pilot program for the rehabilitation of women who suffered violence during the war has been implemented.
Ця програма відбувалася за підтримкою фонду ООН в галузі народонаселення та громадського об'єднання «Неємія» у партнерстві з урядовою уповноваженою з питань гендерної політики, нашою організацією СЕМА Україна, за підтримки уряду Франції та дій ООН проти сексуального насильства під час конфлікту.
This program happened with the support of the UN Population Fund, the Neyemen Foundation, and the Government Commissioner for the Gender Policy, and SEMA Ukraine, with funding from the French government and the UN Action Against Sexual Violence in Conflict.
Хотілося б, щоб продовжилось фінансування такої програми.
We hope for continued funding for this vital program.
Як я вже казала, в Україні продовжується жорстока війна, продовжується незаконне затримання цивільного населення, катування, сексуальні злочини проти українських жінок, чоловіків, дітей.
As I mentioned, the brutal war in Ukraine continues. Civilians are still being unlawfully detained, tortured, and subjected to sexual violence. Women, men, and children alike.
Ці страшні катування привели місяць тому до загибелі в полоні Вікторії Рощиної, 28-річній жінці, української журналістки, котру вбили в російському полоні.
These horrific conditions led to the death of the Victoria Roshina, a 28-year-old Ukrainian journalist who was killed in Russian captivity a month ago.
Я бачу в цьому залі багатьох людей, котрі підтримують українців, котрі разом зі мною вимагають звільнення з російського полону українських жінок.
I see many of you here who have supported Ukrainians, who stand with me in demanding the release of Ukrainian women from Russian captivity.
Дякуючи вашим голосам, ви сприйняли звільненню за останні півроку декількох жінок, котрі провели в полоні понад 6 років.
Thanks to your voices, we have facilitated the release of several women over the past 6 months, some of whom had been held for more than 6 years.
Але там залишаються ще тисячі цивільних українців, котрих продовжують катувати, проти котрих продовжується насильство.
But thousands of civilians are still remain and being tortured and still suffering sexual violence.
Прошу всіх вас стати їх голосами. Прошу всіх вас вимагати їх звільнення. Прошу всіх вас знайти всі механізми, щоб припинити сексуальне насильство і вимагати разом з вами покарання винних в цих злочинах.
I ask all of you to be their voices. I ask all of you to demand their release. And I ask you to find every mechanism to end the sexual violence and demand justice alongside us for those responsible for those crimes. We demand justice and accountability.
Ми вимагаємо справедливості і покарання злочинців.
We demand justice and punishment of those who are responsible. Thank you.
Thank you, Ludmila. We are all Happy that you are free, safe, and here with us today. We'll now hear from Amit Susana, a survivor from Israel.
My name is Amit Susana. I speak before you today as a survivor of the brutal Hamas terror attack on Israel that occurred on October 7, 2023. My life, once simple and quiet, was shattered when I was taken hostage by this ruthless terror group. I worked as an attorney in an office that I truly loved, rented a small house in the kibbutz, and my biggest concern, like most people, was deciding what to have for dinner. My daily routine mainly involved spending time with my friends and family and taking care of my cats. I stayed away from social media and I was a very private person. My privacy was and still is very important to me. I remember the day of my abduction vividly. It began as a peaceful Saturday morning, a holiday in Israel. But the tranquility was shattered by the sound of thousands of missiles launching from Gaza, followed by the terrifying approach of heavy gunfire. I barricaded myself in my safe room, my body trembling from fear. The moment a hand grenade exploded in my living room, my home was invaded by heavily armed men in civilian clothing. I was in my pajamas, barefoot, and decided to take the blanket from my bed to cover myself up. I was dragged from my burning house to the Gaza Strip border, beaten severely along the way. It felt as though they were taking pleasure out of hurting me. They even touched my private body parts while I tried to resist them. I resisted them, though I knew that this might lead to my death, but at that point, I was willing to die. I feared for my body and soul more than I feared for my life, so I fought back. My entire face and body were bruised and swallowed. My eye socket was broken, and I sustained a knee injury from which I still suffer from. I was held captive alone, chained by my ankle with a metal chain, unable to move, and had to ask for permission to use the bathroom. In that house, I was sexually assaulted by the Hamas terrorist who had guarded me. He forced me to go to the shower and entered the room, pointed his gun at me. He was breathing heavily and had a monstrous beast-like face. He meticulously planned his assault, scheming and waiting for the moment to have his way. He kept asking me private sexual questions while sitting next to me in his underwear, lifting my shirt, touching me, and constantly asking me when my period would be over. I knew exactly what he was planning to do, and yet I couldn't do anything to prevent it. I was utterly helpless. When the assault was over, I wasn't even allowed to cry or to be sad. I had no one to comfort me and was forced to act nice to the person who had just sexually assaulted me in the most horrifying way. Not a day goes by that I don't think about what that terrible man did to me, but I keep reminding myself that I'm free now and that he can't hurt me again. A few days later, I was transferred to a new location with different heavily armed Hamas terrorists guarding me. Even though I was terrified, I felt fortunate that at least I wasn't with the man who sexually violated me, because I knew that if I had stayed with him, he would do it again. In the new location, I was tortured, hung upside down, beaten, humiliated, and feared for my life. Eventually, I was taken into an underground tunnel, 40 meters deep, a tomb-like space where we felt as if we were buried alive. We were held in such inhumane conditions. No person should ever be subjected to such brutal and ruthless treatment. After 2 agonizing months, I was freed, but I do not feel free, not while others remain in captivity, enduring the same nightmare. We, the hostages, made a promise to one another. If any of us were released, we would never stop fighting until all were free. Today, I honor this promise by telling my story, no matter how painful it is to relive those horrors. As difficult as it is for me to speak out, it is far more difficult to stay silent. Now that I have regained my freedom, regained my voice, I have decided I cannot stay silent, and I must speak about the horrific crimes that we know that are still occurring there to innocent women and men. I cannot stay silent because of my promise, but also because of the overwhelming silence, even denial of the atrocities that have happened and continue to happen to all the hostages still trapped in Gaza for 383 agonizing days. In January, I met with Ms. Patton and her team, sharing my ordeal with them in detail. She vowed she would never give up on securing the release of the hostages, and she kept her promise. Now, I speak before the UN Security Council, pleading with you to fulfill your duty. Take immediate action to secure the release of those still held captive. Every day that passes steals another piece of their soul and endangers their life. Act now before it is too late. I urge you, do not turn a blind eye to the atrocities being committed against innocent civilians. It is your responsibility to protect human rights, to combat terrorism, and to bring those responsible for these heinous crimes to justice. The world is watching, waiting for the UN Security Council to live up to its mandate. I beg you, do not fail us. Secure the freedom of the hostages and ensure that no one else would suffer the same fate. Remember, it is our collective duty to combat terrorism and protect human rights. The time to act is now. Thank you.
Thank you, Amit, for your brave words. Thank you so much for sharing your testimony with us. Now we'll see a short video from Fatma Omer, a frontline service provider from Sudan, who unfortunately was not able to be here with us in person today.
العاملين في الأمم المتحدة السيدات والسادة مكتب مبعوثة الأمين العام.
Ladies and gentlemen, Office of the SRSG on Sexual Violence and Conflict, I thank you for the kind invitation so you may hear my testimony. I am a doctor and human rights defender. I was an employee at an international organization, and after the war of the 15th of April, I worked for over a year in the gynecology and obstetrics department in a hospital in the area under the control of the Rapid Support Forces. During my work, I would receive 4 to 5 cases of sexual violence per day, and sometimes it would go up to 7 cases per day. And because of the lack of medicines and the security situation, survivors refrained from engaging with the hospital because they were frustrated because of the poor services. I also referred around 20 cases of sexual violence through social media platforms to specialized facilities, and I witnessed during my work, different patterns of violations against women, such as repeated gang rape. And I will never forget the case of the tea seller who was assaulted sexually by 5 individuals. When she arrived at the hospital, she had severe injuries and her treatment took months. I quote her words, "I sell tea so my 3 kids can have food. They put the rifle to my head, and when I resisted, they shot me twice in the thigh and the abdomen to kill me. I wish I had died. My husband kicked me out because I became pregnant as a result of what happened. He took the kids away from me. I will never forget what was perpetrated by the RSF against the mother and her daughter on the 26th of June 2023. They were raped in their home. The most painful and unforgettable cases are those involving children. I treated a 6-month-old baby girl suffering from bleeding and a 5-year-old boy who was repeatedly abused, and the case of an 11-year-old girl who said, and I quote, "My mother went to get water. Military men knocked on the door and asked me who was in the house, and when I showed them, they came into the house and did bad things in my body and left. A 13-year-old came to give birth after being forcibly married under the threat of having her family killed by the forces. The female health workers are exposed to many risks that may even lead to murder. A member of the RSF stabbed a female pharmacist near the hospital because she refused to marry him. And a number of my colleagues were forced to flee the city for the same reason, because they were pursued by the RSF. Some survivors subjected to violence from their families and from the community. The brother of one of the victims contacted me saying that his sister was subjected to violence by her family to prevent her from reaching the center for fear of stigma. I also dealt with victims who were kidnapped and trafficked into forced prostitution. One of the cases said, I was kidnapped by the RSF. For many days, they took turns raping me and took me to forced prostitution in Khartoum, where the RSF pay money to assault us. She said that an attempt was made to smuggle her to Darfur, but the vehicle broke down and she managed to escape. During my work, it became clear that the bodies of women and children are weapons of war that are constantly being used, and this includes the sale of children from the ages of 2 to 7 in the markets in South Khartoum. So, where a boy is sold for 2,000 Sudanese pounds and a girl for 1,000 Sudanese pounds. More than 50% of the cases I dealt with suffer from sexually transmitted diseases such as syphilis, gonorrhea, and others, which greatly exposes the victims to danger, endangers their life, and requires urgent intervention. Based on my harsh experience, I want to give the following recommendations. There is a major deficiency in supporting victims of sexual violence. Health and social centers must be established, and financial support must be provided to ensure that they continue to attend and receive psychological support sessions in these centers, because absence increases suicide rates. Conflict rates in Sudan are witnessing a significant shortage in the provision of sexual violence protocols and basic treatments, which puts thousands of Sudanese men and women at great risk. Survivors must be financially supported to carry out income-generating projects and provide safe homes due to the social stigma that they are exposed to and the abandonment of their families. And psychological and community support must be provided to help them integrate into society and reduce the effects of trauma. Providing protection and safety measures for healthcare workers and female volunteers on the front lines, and taking into account the sensitivity of women's situation due to their constant exposure to abuse and threat, because the walls of the hospitals and the health centers do not provide any protection. There is a need for women from grassroots groups to participate in all decisions regarding the delivery of humanitarian aid and ensuring that aid reaches those affected by the war. It is necessary to facilitate the participation of women and human rights defenders in all their diversity in international forums. The conditions of justice and accountability for perpetrators and criminal prosecution of all those who have committed crimes against women and children must be included in all political processes. The Sudanese government must be pressured to facilitate procedures for access to justice for victims and cooperate with the Independent Commission of Inquiry and facilitate interviewing victims in a safe environment away from criminalization and intimidation. The international community must cooperate with women in Sudan and develop a clear strategy that ensures the participation of women in the political process and in all security arrangements and post-conflict stages.
Women who suffer from sexual gender-based violence, beside torture and extrajudicial killing. Condemn and press the military actors to protect and support millions of women to provide them humanitarian need.
To conclude now, I will give the floor to Nimet Ahmadi, who will bring her perspective as the president of the Women Darfur Association Action Group.
Good morning, Excellencies, civil society colleagues, and distinguished guests. I am deeply honored to join all distinguished speakers today to commemorate the 15th anniversary of the mandate and the office of the Special Representative of Secretary General on Sexual Violence in Conflict Zones. I would like to take this opportunity to recognize the critical impact this office and its mandate have had in shedding light on the darkest corners of our world, conflict zones, where unimaginable suffering occurs. 15 years ago, this office and its mandate were established at a time of desperate need, as wars increasingly targeted women's bodies as a battlegrounds. At that time, Darfur was experiencing the first genocide of the 21st century, where rape was systematically used as a weapon of war to strip away the dignity and break the will of the entire community. The special representative mandate was essential, not just for giving voice to survivors, but shifting the way the international community address and respond to the plight of women in conflict. Knowing that women's voices are often silenced or sidelined during crisis, the mandate ensured they had a spokesperson, such as SRSG Patton and her predecessors, who have tirelessly advocated and continue to bring their suffering to the attention of the UN Security Council and other stakeholders. As we commemorate the office's achievements, it is with great sorrow that I must highlight the ongoing horror that the women of Sudan continue to endure today. Today, sexual gender-based and gender-based violence has once again become a hallmark of war in Sudan, with rape and other forms of sexual violence wielded as weapons. Women whose contribution to the society are immense and unmatched have been systematically demonized for far too long. Since the beginning of war, eyewitnesses' testimonies and reports by both the UN panel of experts and the fact-finding mission confirm that women have been abducted, raped, subjected to sexual slavery, and forced marriages by rapid support forces. With many still missing today, families live in fear, silenced by the threat of retaliation, unable to locate their loved ones. It has been more than 18 months since Sudan was engulfed in vicious violence. While the rapid support forces are still occupying and looting civilians' homes using sexual and gender-based violence and sexual slavery as a tactic of war, the Sudan Armed Forces SAF are launching heavy artillery shelling, airstrikes, and indiscriminate attacks, mainly or mostly targeting civilians' homes, markets, bridges, essential public services, and evacuation routes, with little to no regard for human life. While most of the incidents of sexual and gender-based violence in Sudan are reportedly perpetrated by RSF, reports also indicate that there are some undocumented cases of abuse and exploitation of women by members of SAF in areas under their control. The level of violence against women, deaths, and devastation in Sudan today exhibits a total disregard for international law. It constitutes war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide punishable by international law. The Sudan Armed Forces have utterly failed to protect the women and girls, provide health assistance, or hold perpetrators accountable. The Sudanese authorities must collaborate with the international community to expedite the deployment of forces to protect women and civilians, urgently deliver humanitarian aid, and create an enabling environment for humanitarian aid to reach all in need, and for safe access and response to women's emergency health needs. Today, I must recognize the resilience of the women of Sudan. Despite the horrific violence and threats they face, they have risen beyond their circumstances. Their courage and determination saved countless lives and continue to keep our community together. When the war erupted and all international humanitarian agencies left the country, it felt like the end of the world for the people of Sudan. However, women and youth stepped forward, taking on the role of frontline humanitarian actors. Amidst the significant danger to their lives, they fed the hungry, provided medicine to those suffering from chronic diseases, documented atrocities, and identified safe routes for those fleeing violence. Today, the situation has gotten out of hand, and it is no longer possible or safe for the locals to provide life-saving assistance or find safety for women and girls. Excellencies, I am appalled by the stories of horror we hear daily. Women and girls have been raped multiple times, sometimes in front of their fathers, husbands, sons, or community leaders, to break the will and destroy their dignity. These women and girls have no protection, no access to humanitarian or medical assistance, and nowhere to turn for help, particularly in Darfur, where RSF strongholds remain impassable. Recent intensified attacks and attacks in Al-Fashir have brought untold suffering on civilians. Systematic attack on medical facilities, restriction on communications, and deliberate obstruction of humanitarian aid by the warring parties are making it nearly impossible for survivors to access life-saving services, including sexual and reproductive health services. This is the horrific reality that the people of Sudan face today, and the Sudanese women need the world's attention, protection, and justice more than ever. Ethnic targeting of women has been well documented. The UN panel of experts and many other reports underline sexual violence committed by members of the RSF and allied militia in all areas under their control, and the targeting of women due to their Masalit and other indigenous African ethnicities. These reports have only confirmed what we have been hearing about for more than a year against women from the Masalit for the Gawa tribe, particularly in the IDPs camp in Darfur. Despite these shocking stories of horror and the gross human rights violations against women of Sudan, they are yet to be protected. And the bare minimum of their emergency needs have yet to be met. Now, it is not the time for us to tell the stories. We must do something that can tangibly change the grim reality for the countless women in Sudan, particularly those trapped in Darfur after 2 decades of genocidal attack on their lives and dignity. It is high time for the international community, the Security Council, to take measures and use the tools at their disposal to protect women, ensure the urgent delivery of humanitarian aid to those in need, and equally hold perpetrators and enablers accountable. I would like to review with this recommendation. In regard to the mandate and the office, Security Council members must swiftly address the challenges facing the office of SRSG, including securing access to timely field visits to conflict areas like Sudan, to meet survivors and their communities, to bring first-hand information that will inform policymaking at the Security Council, increase resources to ensure the office has increased capacity and strengthen the mandate for timely reporting and advancing accountability. All state parties must meet their obligation and respect the mandate. With regard to the violence against women in Sudan, we urge the Security Council and all stakeholders to expedite the delivery of humanitarian aid. Without delivery of humanitarian aid, women cannot be protected. With emphasis on emergency response to women's needs. The Security Council must authorize international UN forces to protect civilians in Sudan, with the protection of women as an urgent priority. Demand that all parties immediately cease all attacks against women and acts of sexual and gender-based violence, and hold perpetrators accountable. The Sudanese authorities must collaborate with the Security Council to ensure an AU to ensure that protection forces are deployed, protection forces are deployed in Sudan to save life. Prioritize the creation of new, well-equipped and more substantial UN presence on the ground to ensure civilian protection and humanitarian operation across the Sudan and document violation of international law. Ensure that women's rights are central to all criminal accountability processes, making violation of women's rights and all forms of sexual and gender-based violence an explicit criterion for imposing sanction on individuals responsible. Maintain and enforce the current arms embargo on Darfur and expand it to all of Sudan and all parties involved in the conflict. Demand and support full, equal, safe, and meaningful participation of Sudanese women in all processes of de-escalation, peace-building, humanitarian, justice and accountability effort, and all political processes regarding Sudan's future. The suffering of women of Sudan has allowed to go on for far too long because of the world's indifference. We cannot afford another 20 years, and we cannot afford even 2 days. It has to be stopped, and it has to be done now. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Ahmadi. We are all appalled by the violence in Sudan and the scale and scope of it and the lack of attention in the international media and arena to it. Thank you for that. We'll now hear the pre-recorded, UN-verified testimonies of 2 Palestinian survivors of conflict-related sexual violence. Well, they were invited, as the others were, to be here today. Due to protection and other concerns, they were unable to be. Their testimonies have been translated from Arabic, and in the recordings, their written testimonies are being read out by third persons, and these are male survivors.
The following testimonies from a Palestinian male survivor from the West Bank who was held in an Israeli prison between 2022 and 2024 without charges or trial. The following testimony concerns the sexual violence in detention he was subjected to by Israeli security forces after 7 October 2023.
I was in the room as they pulled us one by one. I could hear the sound of crying and screaming in the room. I was the last one in the cell, and my feet were shaking with fear from the severity of what I heard from the prisoners being beaten. I was taken and pulled forcefully from the room by 2 members of the force, cursing my mother and sisters. In the kitchen, I saw the prisoners completely naked, lying on top of each other, with blood flowing from them and into the ground. Some of them were crying and screaming. I was stripped naked by 2 of them like the rest of the prisoners, and they threw me on top of them. One of the guards brought an object from the kitchen and put it in my anus. The soldiers' attempts continued as they filmed me on their phones while I was crying and screaming from the horror of what was happening to me for about 3 minutes, after which the guards left after screaming at us that we had only 2 minutes to get dressed. I was getting dressed and tears were streaming from my eyes. I felt like I was broken from the inside as they took us back to our cell. We were in the room in a state of shock, tears falling from our eyes without a sound. No one was talking to each other. None of us wanted to look at each other. I was saying, "What happened? Why are they doing this to us?" During a court hearing to extend detention, I told the judge that we had been assaulted and beaten and that our sanctity and privacy had been violated. The judge said that the beating had stopped. I told him we were beaten today, Your Honour. The judge placed his hands on his head and remained silent.
The following testimony is from a Palestinian male survivor from the West Bank who who was held in an Israeli detention center for approximately 6 months. The following testimony concerns sexual violence in detention he was subjected to by Israeli security forces after 7 October 2023.
At an identified military base, the soldier came and beat me very harshly and pinned me to the wall like the last time. He attacked me, slapped and punched me. He then opened his phone and accessed Google Translate, spoke into it in Hebrew, and got back an Arabic translation that said, "If you move from where you are, I will rape you." During the admission procedures to prison, soldiers would ask the detainee to insult his mother and sisters while filming the detainee saying it. If the detainee does not obey the orders, the soldiers would give a signal for someone else to hit him with his stick. I refused to insult my mom and sisters in this matter because I do not accept the idea that I see myself on TikTok cursing my deceased mother. The soldier beat me violently on my back, and when he got tired of the beating, he tried to insert the stick into my anus. I was turning my body to the other side in an effort to stop that from happening. I tried to protect myself as much as possible. When the soldier could not do what he intended to do, he cursed me and then kicked me in the face. I was dragged into the processing and registration room. My handcuffs were removed from my hands, and was I surprised to see how bloody and swollen my hands were. There was a male nurse and more than one soldier in the room. There was someone conducting the inspection and another conducting the registration procedures. They asked me routine questions, and during the inspection, a soldier hit me on my genitals in a violent manner that left me swirling in pain on the ground. The beating continued for more than 10 minutes, after which they tied me back again. The soldiers then forced me to walk a distance of 15 meters from the first to the second room on my knees. All throughout this walk, I was beaten on my back by the soldiers in a hysterical manner while uttering obscene words and cursing my mother and punching me all over my body.
We will now hear from Charles-Pierre Fontaine-Lamercie, a service provider from Haiti who works with survivors who have experienced conflict-related sexual violence at the hands of armed gangs there.
Thank you. Mesdames,
Ladies and gentlemen, representatives of the United Nations, I'm speaking on behalf of Charles-Pierre de la Merci Fontaine, the General Coordinator of an organization for women entitled the Organization Women in Action, OFAVA, which since 2008 has ensured holistic care and support for women and girls surviving from sexual violence. These are women that are involved in social life, in combating violence against women and girls, and protecting them from survivors of gender-based violence. I wish to thank the SRSG on sexual violence in conflict. Thank you. Thank you for giving us this opportunity to show to what extent our country represents an extremely dangerous environment for us, for women, girls, the women and girls of Haiti. The greatest problem facing my country currently remains that of insecurity. Recently, gangs have seen an rapid increase in their numbers. They have extended the territories and the forces under their control over the economic and political structures of Haiti. They are criminal and mafia-based armed groups. We estimate 200 gangs are operating today in Haiti, and approximately 95 are in the capital. Gang-related violence has increased significantly. There have been kidnappings and other criminal acts leading to the displacement of thousands of people, in particular women and children. There's an average of 20 women or girls who are victim every day, or become victims every day, and others have disappeared. Since January 2024, violence has reached more than 18,500 people killed and 1,850 civilians. Since October, we have seen a new wave of displacements. The Dominican Republic having begun to repatriate more and more Haitians. During this repatriation, our organization was informed this Monday evening of at least 2 cases of sexual violence. Haitian women and girls are subjected to sexual violence in all its forms, through their partners, their families, the gangs in their neighborhoods, their neighbors, as they flee the insecurity in Haiti. In major cities, we have seen that the population is leaving rapidly, although they continue to face the violence perpetrated by these criminal gangs. In the improvised camps, the displaced are not exempt from the crimes of the gangs. More than 73,000 from the metropolitan region were chased from their homes, and over the latest months, they're finding refuge in these camps. 70% are women and girls. The primary hospital and provider of essential health care and maternity care and medical assistance for women and girls who are victims of violence remains closed due to violence committed by the gangs. Survivor girls who are pregnant due to rape also have no access to health care or essential services, despite the high level of undesired pregnancies, of maternal deaths linked to violence, sexual violence, in a context where these acts have increased by more than 75% when compared to last year. The situation of women, girls, and children becomes more alarming in Haiti every day, particularly in Port-au-Prince, where impunity reigns. The gangs are constantly equipped, always have munitions. Sexual violence is of a catastrophic scope. Victims are raped several times by one or several armed aggressors. And this is several days or several weeks that this takes place. The population is suffering, the local population. considered to be sexual objects. This is particularly true of women and girls. The rapists at times use videos of rapes to force families of the victims to pay a ransom. The gangs use rape as a weapon of war, and gang control over communities is increased since the deployment of the multinational support force for Haiti. The community bodies are incapable of responding to the needs for protection that have arisen from the current crisis. Women, girls no longer have the right to protection or security. No woman or girl should die. No woman should suffer from violence or rape or other sexual violence. Bolstering the technical capacity of government services is necessary in healthcare, in particular mental health and specialized services, so as to respond to the needs of victims of sexual violence and those displaced within the country. Civil society organizations like mine are ready to support these efforts. But we need rapid financing to support the most vulnerable and strengthen community actions for protection and prevention. With all these obstacles in mind, there is much that remains to be done as the crisis continues in an uncontrollable spread. The security situation continues to both fuel the humanitarian crisis and to hamper the response. In a context, the security state of emergency state is throughout the country. The local forces, supported by others, are carrying out major operations to attempt to regain territory occupied by criminal gangs. And security must reign. Legal assistance must also be provided to all those women or girls who need it, so as to ensure equitable access to justice. The judicial system also needs to be reformed to guarantee that the presumed perpetrators of criminal acts and rape are judged. Ladies and gentlemen, my country has become ruled by gangs. I am launching an alarm to all those countries that are friendly to mine to increase their support for the humanitarian response to assist my people, the people of Haiti, because if nothing is done, then women, girls will and will remain the first victims. Thank you.
Thank you, La Merci. Thank you so much for sharing your work and the challenges you face and highlighting the situation in Haiti, which we just heard about yesterday, in fact, in the Security Council. To conclude this portion of the program, we're going to see a short video from Ms. Jeneth Bedoya Lima, a Colombian journalist, a survivor, and a women's human rights defender and global champion in the fight against conflict-related sexual violence. She was unable to be here with us today, but she still wanted to lend her voice to this program. Do we have that video? Okay.
Reciban un saludo muy especial.
I should like to greet you. I'm Janeth Bedoya-Lima, a journalist, a survivor of kidnapping, torture and sexual violence. 24 years ago, while practicing my profession, I was kidnapped while working on a report. And for a long time, I decided to remain silent about what had happened because I believed that I had no right to be a victim. Journalists believe that our sole duty is to inform. But 15 years ago, when I understood the need to raise my voice, I started a crusade, a campaign called No es hora de callar, it's no time to remain silent, which allowed me to open an important door here in Colombia so that women could report sexual violence. That's why it's an honor for me to be a part of the UN Global Champions to prevent sexual violence in the context of armed conflicts. Working alongside Madam Pramila Patten is not only a great challenge, but also an immense responsibility, because we are amplifying the voices of millions of women, men, boys, and girls around the world who have faced sexual violence. Today is a very special day. I continue to practice journalism under threat, and that is the worst affront to freedom of expression. But I also understand that if I silence myself, if I self-censor, I will prevent many people from being able to move forward with their lives. This work, alongside Pramila, has helped me to understand that journalism can transform realities, and that those of us who have faced sexual violence have the opportunity to transform these realities. To all the people gathered today in New York, I want to remind you that a survivor of sexual violence is someone who has to learn to live with pain. And their great effort and motivation is to be able to transform it into something positive. So to the partners, to those who support us, to those who believe in us, to those who help us amplify our voices, thank you. Because this is not just a problem for those of us who carry the burden of sexual violence. This is a responsibility of all societies, of governments, of those who can help us to change and prevent the reality that millions of people face today in Afghanistan, the Middle East, in Africa, Central America, or here in my country, Colombia. Don't forget that our voice needs your support. And thank you to everyone who makes it possible for that voice to keep resounding throughout the world. It is no time to be silent.
I want to thank all of our panelists and for your courage, for your frankness, for your voices, and sharing your testimony with us. And I'm going to invite you now to move back down into the audience, and we're going to hear our final panel for this morning session. And I want to invite to the podium Dr. Natalia Kanem, Undersecretary General and Executive Director from the UN Population Fund. Ms. Sima Bahous, Undersecretary General and Executive Director of UN Women. And Ms. Zumi Nakamitsu, Undersecretary General and High Representative from the UN Office on Disarmament Affairs. They are all part of they're the heads of the three entities that are part of the UN Action Network that is chaired by SRSG Patton. So welcome, ladies. And I will ask Ms. Nakamitsu to start this panel off. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Madam Moderator. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for the opportunity today. Today marks the 15th anniversary of the establishment of the mandate of the Special Representative of the Secretary General on Sexual Violence in Conflict. I actually remember very vividly the day this office was created. I supported the establishment of this particular office very strongly at the time. I was a policy director at the then Department of Peacekeeping Operations. The moving testimony of survivors of this international crime, which we just heard, very sadly, very unfortunately, speaks to its continued prevalence of this crime globally. As the Security Council recognized in its resolution 1888, addressing conflict-related sexual violence requires actions to end impunity and pursue accountability, of course, for these heinous acts. But also importantly, it requires our collective focus on efforts to prevent them. Disarmament, arms control, and demilitarization must form a key part of these prevention efforts, as the proliferation of weapons is both a driver and enabler of conflict-related sexual violence. This was made evident earlier this year when the Security Council focused its open debate on conflict-related sexual violence, on disarmament and arms control. I will highlight very quickly just 3 aspects in this regard. First, weapons and ammunition are directly used by perpetrators to commit sexual violence, to threaten or coerce survivors, and to injure or kill. This is backed by research from the United Nations Institute for Disarmament Research, which indicates that in states where data was available, approximately 70 to 90% of incidents of conflict-related sexual violence involved small arms and light weapons. Second, the proliferation of weapons and militarization nourishes conditions of instability. Such conditions, especially when governance capacity is limited, facilitate the activities of armed groups, traffickers, and smugglers. This exacerbates risks for women and girls who already face insecurity, including from forced displacement, and creates an environment in which perpetrators perceive that they can carry out acts of conflict-related sexual violence with impunity. Third, increasing global military spending increases militarization, can exacerbate the risk of conflict recurring, and diverts funds away from social infrastructure, including protection services for survivors. Recognizing these links should be a call to action to implement comprehensive arms control and disarmament measures in gender-responsive manner, considering both the gendered impacts of weapons and supports gender equality outcomes in addressing these impacts. Now, let me just briefly speak to a few priority areas for action. Mainstreaming gender in national implementation of arms control treaties and instruments, and enhancing cooperation between authorities responsible for arms control and protection from violence is a critical area. This helps to prevent the diversion, illicit trade, or transfer of small arms and light weapons in conflict and post-conflict zones where there is a risk of conflict-related sexual violence. Gender-responsive management of weapons and ammunition from their acquisition, stockpiling, transfer, tracing, and disposal is another important measure. Addressing the different impacts of weapons and ammunition management throughout their life cycle on women, men, girls, and boys can support more effective arms control measures and prevent their diversion. As states recognized in June this year at the 4th Review Conference on the Program of Action on Small Arms and Light Weapons, addressing gender roles, norms, and expectations to acquire illicit arms can be a powerful tool in preventing and combating the root causes and enablers of conflict-related sexual violence. Supporting women's full, equal, meaningful, and effective participation and empowerment in disarmament and arms control remains an important goal. However, this is also where efforts often remain elusive. Women are significantly underrepresented in multilateral arms control and disarmament processes and face barriers to participating in conventional arms control at the national level. Removing the barriers for women's participation not only contributes to breaking down the gender norms and challenges patriarchal systems that drive conflict-related sexual violence, it also leads to more effective response efforts. My office, the UN Office for Disarmament Affairs, is working with member states and partners to drive progress on these priority areas, including by examining linkages between arms proliferation and conflict-related sexual violence, providing capacity-building support for gender-responsive small arms control policies and programs, and participating in initiatives to support women's participation, leadership, and empowerment in disarmament processes and technical arms control roles. As a member of UN Action Against Sexual Violence in Conflict, my office also ensures arms control and disarmament efforts are integrated in system-wide activities on this issue. I and my office remain committed to working with member states, civil society, and with United Nations partners to bolster our efforts to prevent the scourge of conflict-related sexual violence. I can say it is absolutely my top priority personally. I thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, High Representative. Now I will turn to Dr. Natalia Kanem, Executive Director of the UN Population Fund.
Excellencies, Under Secretary General Pramila Patten, honorable survivors, distinguished guests, dear civil society leaders, dear colleagues, dear young people, I greet you in peace, so precious, so fragile, so needed in our turbulent world. And I join in commending the Office of the Special Representative of the Secretary General on Sexual Violence in Conflict for gathering us together and for your leadership, your courage over the past 15 years. The mandate of UNFPA, the lead UN agency for addressing gender-based violence in humanitarian settings means that we work closely together with you and with all members of the UN Action Network across the world. And this harrowing testimony that we've heard here today reminds us, it tells us that survivors of sexual violence contribute least to war and conflict, yet suffer the worst of its consequences. UNFPA witnesses this each and every day as we protect and try to heal women and girls who are haunted by unspeakable acts, acts that demand an answer and that demand an end to impunity. I will recall Fabienne from Haiti, who recently recounted to UNFPA how she was brutalized by gang members on her way to collect water. And this is an attack that has left her with physical scars and deep psychological trauma. She told us, before I was a cheerful and outgoing person. Afterwards, I'm now closed off. I'm wary of everyone. I'm always crying. Fortunately, Fabienne got to a UNFPA-supported hospital with gender-based violence protection and response services, one of the few that are still offering such programs amid the turmoil and the insecurity in Haiti. And listening to the voices of survivors like Fabienne is going to be crucial to end these horrors and to mobilize a meaningful response. Sexual violence indeed is a war crime that attempts to silence voices that are pleading for peace and justice, and this is wrong. And that silence only deepens when those who do speak out go unheard and unresponded to, and when those who perpetrate these horrific crimes go unpunished. Together, we are beginning to break the silences. Together, we are bringing some urgency to our quest to end this abrogation of our common humanity. Every survivor deserves protection, deserves quality care, deserves access to justice. Just last year, 2023, more than 5.9 million people found safety and protection from gender-based violence with the support of UNFPA, but yet the needs are staggering. And much more is needed by way of resources to support this type of life-saving work. To turn the tide, we have to turn to action, and we need to act decisively. And I would say start by closing the funding gap. Less than 15% of the funds needed to prevent and respond to gender-based violence and crises is currently available. And that prevents us from reaching every survivor, women, girls, men, boys, everyone, who need the support. And the inadequate funding also limits our ability to deliver the full spectrum of services, which have to include legal and psychological support. Now, to ensure equitable access to services, we will have to follow a survivor-centered approach, prioritizing the privacy, the dignity, the safety of survivors and their data at every stage, and empowering them to make their own decisions. And let's also urgently address the pervasive underreporting of cases by tackling the stigma and fear. And we heard a lot about that today. Fear of reprisals that silence many survivors. We do need to create safe reporting mechanisms that will ensure confidentiality. And these are data that are going to help us to track incidents, but also to track our progress. Finally, I'd say strengthen our collaborations, and this is why we appreciate the work of Pramila and her team so much. Integrating what we do together into wider frameworks under the Sustainable Development Goals and addressing gender equality and other root causes that fuel these cycles of violence. For UNFPA, of course, we are fully committed to even accelerating those collective efforts to make conflict-related sexual violence history once and for all. What we need now is the sustained political will, the adequate funding, and the coordinated responses that will ensure accountability and meaningful change. It was the Nobel laureate, Toni Morrison, who said, "Don't let anybody convince you this is the way the world is and therefore must be. It must be the way it ought to be," end quote. So let us say that the fate of humanity does not belong in the hands of men who choose to wage war and to use women's bodies as a battleground. It rests with all of us standing together, waging peace, demanding justice, and giving survivors of sexual violence and everyone bright hope for a brighter tomorrow. Thank you.
Thank you, Executive Director Khanum. I'll now turn to Sima Bahous, Undersecretary General and Executive Director of UN Women.
Thank you, SRSG Patton, Excellencies, brave survivors. It is an honor to participate in today's commemorative event. I thank you, brave survivors, for the powerful and moving testimonies we heard this morning and are yet to hear this afternoon from survivors from Colombia, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Haiti, Iraq, Israel, Myanmar, the occupied Palestinian territory, South Sudan, Syria, and Ukraine. I also want to thank you for being here today and for sharing your voices and your moving testimonies. We are humbled by your courage and your continued drive for accountability and justice. Your leading role in the pursuit of peace is where we take our inspiration. We must and will heed your calls for strengthening prevention efforts to ensure that sexual violence in conflict happens no more. Thank you, SRSG Patton, and the permanent missions of Sierra Leone, the Democratic Republic of Congo, the United Kingdom, the United States of America, Switzerland, and Norway for bringing us together today. Excellencies, I also would like to take this opportunity to commend SRSG Patton for her leadership and courage, and to thank her team also for their tireless work over the past 15 years. We heard from SRSG Patton this morning in depth about her work and findings from horrendous conflicts the world over, also detailed in the report of the Secretary General on conflict-related sexual violence. I will speak to what we can do jointly as part of the United Nations Action Network to prevent and eliminate conflict-related sexual violence. 15 years since the Security Council committed to address war's oldest crime, sexual violence in conflict, we gather at a time when we are perhaps more acutely aware of all the violence against women and girls around the world than ever before. But it is in times of great challenge that we must stand together in the resolve that the situation is not hopeless and we are not helpless. We stand together as one UN, and UN Women stands here as a proud founding member of the UN Action Network. We bring our expertise and experience in amplifying the voices of women and girls, men and boys living in conflict and affected by conflict-related sexual violence. We bring it to UN Action. For UN Women, our approach to addressing CRSV focuses on tackling pre-existing gender inequalities and impunity as root causes. Where possible, we contribute in-country monitoring and reporting to CRSV incidents as a member of the MARA working groups, where we handle monitoring, analysis, and reporting arrangements. We champion and support and fund women-led organizations and civil society organizations who are first to respond in the aftermath of violence and first to be targeted. We support brave women, human rights defenders, who are often the first to seek justice many times at risk to their own lives. And UN Women deploys gender experts to the Human Rights Council-mandated investigative bodies that document human rights violations and international crimes, including conflict-related sexual violence. Importantly, we stay in countries in times of crisis, and we deliver vital support where it is needed most. We stand with and support all survivors. We ensure their voices are heard. We invest in their protection and in the promotion of their full rights. Tomorrow is the annual debate on women, peace, and security at the Security Council. There we will hear the report of the Secretary General and the findings of that report. We will hear that the proportion of women killed in conflict in 2023 alone has doubled. We will also hear the Secretary General's 8 recommendations, including on accountability. So, Excellencies, my hope echoes that of the speakers before me, that all those who are experiencing conflict will soon know peace, that we end impunity once and for all, and that accountability for sexual violence will become the standard rather than the exception. UN Women is honored to continue to work together, led by the courage and strength of all survivors. It is time to silence the guns. It is time for peace everywhere. I thank you.
Thank you, Executive Director Bahous, and thank you to all our panelists for your remarks, your important work that your agencies do to advance the protection of women in conflict. Before I just close out this morning's session, SRSG Patton, would you like to share any closing thoughts? No? Okay. All right, well, I hope that you were all very moved by what you heard today, moved not just emotionally, but to action. Much must still be done to prevent and protect women in conflict. Thank you for your participation, your attention. Thank you to those of you who joined us online. And just a reminder that the afternoon session will start promptly in this room at 3 p.m., and we look forward to having you back with us then. Thank you.